Hello, this is Patrice, and for the next hour, I will be reading from the June 23rd issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Election updates. Voting in New York's high stakes primaries enters final hours. Candidates made last minute campaign stops as New Yorkers pick nominees in a half dozen House races that could test the power of progressive Democrats. There are also closely watched races in Utah, Maryland, and South Carolina. This article is by Nicholas Fandos and Andy Newman. Here's the latest. After months of a raucous campaign, New Yorkers are heading to the polls on Tuesday to decide a packed slate of congressional primaries that feature ascendant Democratic socialists, rival AI giants, and a Kennedy scion. The races across the state and in other Democratic primaries taking place in Utah and Maryland are helping shape a broader struggle over the party's direction as the midterm primary season accelerates. Among the biggest storylines in New York was a major gamble by Mayor Zoran Mondami, who is trying to parlay his popularity to expand his leftist movement. In his sights, two Democratic incumbents, Representatives Daniel Goldman and Adriano Espaillat, whom the left views as too friendly to corporate interests and to Israel, as well as a third seat being vacated by Representative Nadia Velasquez. Turnout in the city is lighter so far than it was during last year's mayoral primary, which propelled Mr. Mondami toward victory. About 260,000 people, including early voters but not mail in voters, had cast ballots by noon on Tuesday, compared with 605,000 at this time last year, according to the Board of Elections. In the suburbs north of the city, Democrats are picking their nominee to challenge Representative Mike Lawler, one of the Republicans' most vulnerable incumbents, in November. And in the heart of Manhattan, voters will select a Democrat to replace Representative Gerald Nadler in a high power district that is home to Broadway, the Democratic donor class, and more Fortune 500 companies than any other. Its star studded field of competitors include the grandson of John F. Kennedy, and has prompted nearly 40 million in super PAC spending by the AI industry and the former New York City Mayor Michael R. Bloomberg. Here's what else to know. Outside of New York City and the rest of New York State, in the North Country, a Republican primary fight to replace Representative Elise Stefanik has gotten ugly and is fueling Democrat dreams of flipping the district this fall. New Yorkers will also decide whether to keep their state controller of 2 decades or ditch him for a more progressive alternative. Maryland House primaries, pro Israel and pro crypto super PACs have spent millions to back Adrian Bofo, a moderate state delegate in a crowded primary for the Democratic nomination to succeed the retiring Representative Steny Hoyer. In another district, former Representative David Trone is seeking to oust the woman he endorsed to succeed him in Congress, Representative April McLean Delaney, in one of the country's most expensive House primaries. In the Utah House primary, court ordered redistricting in Utah led to the creation of a deep blue congressional district in Salt Lake City, meaning that Utah is likely to elect a Democrat to Congress this fall for the first time since 2018. Ben McAdams, a moderate former congressman who won that 2018 race, is the front runner in the Democratic primary. He faces three progressive challengers, including Nate Bluin, a state senator backed by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. In the South Carolina runoff, in a runoff in the Republican primary for governor, President Trump has given his coveted endorsement to both candidates, Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette, his pick in the first round, and Alan Wilson, South Carolina's longtime attorney general. I can't hurt one of them by endorsing the other, Mr. Trump wrote on social media, adding, with either one, you can't go wrong. The winner will face the Democratic State Representative Jermaine Johnson. South Carolina has not elected a Democratic governor since 1998. As Chinese tech pulls ahead, U.S. fears it will become dependent. Chinese firms have some of the world's most advanced technology, but U.S. officials say relying on it could come with a downside. This article is by Anna Swanson. At a factory in southeastern China, robot arms spin balletically winding long strips of metal into rolls and shaping them into bricks that are destined to become batteries. As workers in white coveralls watch, the nascent batteries are packaged into aluminum cases and, as workers put it, given life, endowed with an electrical charge that will eventually power cars and data centers across the world. The site, owned by Contemporary Amperex Technology Company Ltd., or CATL, is the world's largest cluster of battery factories and the most advanced. Inside its walls, the dynamic between the United States and China is changing. For decades, American companies maintained a huge technological lead over their Chinese competitors. U.S. firms came to China to manufacture their goods more cheaply. As a price of entry, the Chinese government forced foreign companies into partnerships where Chinese firms could learn from them and absorb their more advanced technology. In at least a few sectors, that equation has flipped, with China racing ahead of the United States. From batteries and solar panels to rare earths and life sciences, China is developing some of the world's most advanced technologies, and it is rapidly deploying plans to corner other markets. CATL is indicative of that shift. It has unveiled a battery that, according to the company, can power an electric vehicle for 250 miles with less than 10 minutes of charging, about 3 times the charging speed of batteries typically found in other electric vehicles. CATL's battery technology is powering millions of cheap electric vehicles that China is exporting around the world. The company sees further potential in America's enormous car market. Of course, if there's an opportunity in the US, we wish to pursue it, said Fred Zhang, a company spokesman. These advances are raising major questions for US officials who see danger in relying too much on Chinese technology. Lawmakers and some administration officials argue that China has used predatory practices to build a dominant position in batteries and other fields. They say that it has hollowed out the industrial base of other countries, including the United States, and extended the Chinese government's power globally. Over the past year, Beijing weaponized its control over global supply chains, cutting off mineral exports and threatening to shut down U.S. factories to force the Trump administration to back down on tariffs. China has described its control of other industries, like pharmaceuticals, as a potential future lever over foreign governments. Representative John Moliner, a Michigan Republican who is chairman of the House Select Committee on China, said China had subsidized CATL to undercut non-China competitors and build worldwide dependence. Entrusting a critical industry to the company would be a grave error, he added. But others say not working with Chinese firms like CATL will lead U.S. companies to fall behind, eroding America's position in important industries. Walling off the world's most dynamic economies could also slow progress towards scientific and technological advances and impede efforts to combat climate change. For decades now, we've been used to the world where the technology and innovation comes out of the West, said Kyle Chan, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, a Washington think tank. The tables are turning. The United States appears to be at an inflection point where it must choose if it wants to use China's cheap and advanced battery technology or spend much more to develop an independent supply chain for an industry that could come to underpin much of U.S. energy infrastructure. American officials have been firmly opposed to Chinese car imports, seeing them as a fast ticket to destroying the U.S. auto industry. But they are more divided over the batteries that go into cars, power plants, and data centers because most major battery makers are foreign companies. General Motors has invested with South Korean battery makers to build a non-Chinese supply chain, but other U.S. automakers already considered CATL a vital partner. CATL sells batteries to Tesla and has licensed its technology to Ford Motor to use in plants in Michigan and Kentucky. Ford Motor collaborated with the South Korean battery maker SK On in its Kentucky factory, but dissolved the partnership in December. Republicans have scrapped Biden administration incentives for electric vehicles, cooling the EV market in the United States. This year, Ford said it would pivot the Kentucky plant to make batteries for energy producers and data centers, an area where Congress still provides subsidies. CATL's presence in the United States has been controversial. In 2023, the Virginia governor at the time, Glenn Youngkin, blocked a Ford CATL factory, calling it a Trojan horse for the Chinese Communist Party. In 2025, the US government added CATL to a list of Chinese military companies, saying it was indirectly affiliated with top bodies of the Chinese government. CATL said that the designation, which barred the company from US defense contracts, was a mistake and that had never engaged in any military business. This is a long article. I'm going to just fast forward to the end and just read the conclusion. Albert Bourla, the chief executive of Pfizer, said in March that one of Pfizer's biggest challenges was how to tap into the meteoric rise of China's scientific abilities in the midst of geopolitical tensions. Mr. Bourla predicted that China would surpass the United States in biopharmaceutical innovation within this decade, saying the country had carried out a strategic plan over decades to reform regulations, file patents, fund research, and cultivate talent. They built their science, so this is where we need to become better, Mr. Borla said. So again, I skipped a big middle part of that article. If you'd like to hear it in its entirety, the number to call is 716-821-5555. Photos behind Kennedy Center tarps show no sign of Trump's name. Images circulated by an activist group reveal bare marble where the President Trump's name once resided. The Kennedy Center previously told a federal judge it had been removed. This article is by Julia Jacobs. The removal of President Trump's name from the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which was ordered by a federal judge, was carried out this month behind a towering matrix of scaffolding and tarps obscuring the work from curious onlookers. But photos of the building's marble facade circulated to the news media by an activist group that has opposed the Trump administration's takeover of the center show the public for the first time the blank marble where the president's name had once been. The photos were shared with journalists by Mallory Miller, a former employee of the Kennedy Center who co-founded the group Hands Off the Arts, which started organizing protests around the Arts Center after the president took over as its board chairman. The Kennedy Center did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Late last month, Judge Christopher R. Cooper of Federal District Court in Washington ruled that the center's board, which is stocked with Mr. Trump's allies, did not have the legal authority to rename the center. He said that power rested with Congress, which dedicated the institution as a living memorial to President Kennedy in 1964, not long after his assassination. The Kennedy Center is appealing the judge's decision, arguing that people and companies who have given or will be giving millions of dollars to the center were only willing to do so with the name Trump on the building. The center filed its notice of appeal shortly before a legal deadline to remove Mr. Trump's name. Both the district court and a federal appeals court rejected initial requests to pause the judge's decision pending its appeal. As the deadline loomed on June 12th and hundreds of onlookers watched, workers covered the scaffolding with white tarps before removing the 18 letters from the marble. A gap in the tarps allowed a New York Times photographer to observe a worker pulling the letter A from the wall. The following morning, the center's executive director, Matt Plaka, filed a sworn declaration with the court confirming that the name had been removed, though the public was not able to see it for itself. The obscuring of the facade has drawn complaints from Democratic lawmakers, including Representative Joyce Beatty of Ohio, an ex officio member of the board whose lawsuit led to the judge's order. In court papers filed in the case, Ms. Beatty's lawyers argued last week that the tarps were a bizarre and unnecessary privacy screen intended to assuage defendants' vanity or massage broken egos. Officials for the center said last week that the scaffolding and tarp will remain up as crews address maintenance needs of the marble and soffit panels. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump says vandals sabotaged the reflecting pool. Internal documents raise doubts. The documents do not indicate that the peeling blue coating and algae blooms were caused intentionally. This article is by Maxine Joslow and David A. Farenthold. President Trump says the peeling blue coating coating and algae blooms that mar his his $16.4 million renovation of the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool are the fault of vandals working with knives in the dark of night. But government documents obtained by the New York Times show that while National Park Service workers found 2 cuts in sections of foam between the pool's expansion joints, those were not directly related to the American flag blue coating that is now peeling or to the algae that has turned the pool a bright shade of green. Even as the documents show workers were attempting to address deteriorating conditions, Trump administration officials were insisting publicly that the pool was pristine. The pool had been drained, resealed, and then refilled by June 5th. 4 days later, Park Service workers discovered holes, cracks, and peeling caulking in parts of the pool, along with cuts in sections of the foam, according to the documents. The cause of the cuts was unclear, while a June 9 report by the U.S. Park Police described the cuts as razor blade slashes made along a 20-foot-long stretch of the foam. The administration has yet to present evidence supporting that assertion. The documents reviewed by the Times described them as two 171-foot blade cuts, but did not address how they were made. By June 16th, workers had noticed that chunks of blue sealant that had covered the pool's bottom were peeling and floating to the surface, the documents show. That sealant was separate from the foam in the pool's expansion joints, which allows its concrete slabs to expand and contract. The workers had also discovered that some devices installed to kill algae were not working as intended, according to the documents, and enormous algae blooms had turned portions of the pool bright green instead of dark blue. But on June 15, Mr. Trump was still declaring the renovation a success, telling reporters that I'm very good at building things and constructing things. The reflecting pool is a centerpiece of Mr. Trump's attempts to remake the Capitol in honor of the nation's 250th birthday. The pool has been plagued by leaks and algae for decades. Mr. Trump boasted that he had repaired it quickly and affordably, but both problems have returned in force. Work to fix the problems may not be finished until after July 4th, a setback for the president who had pushed for the renovation project to be completed before then. On Saturday, Mr. Trump acknowledged the pool would have to be at least partially drained for more work. On Tuesday, the president said on social media that 6 people had been arrested and 7 others had been cited for slashing the pool sealant with a sharp knife or razors. It was purposely and criminally done, and somebody had to work very hard, probably in the dark of night, he wrote. Mr. Trump also told reporters on Monday, without offering evidence, that vandals had poured fertilizer into the pool to feed the algae. Neither the Interior Department nor the White House would provide charging documents, citations, or names of anyone arrested. They did share the Park Police incident report, which said any suspect or suspects were unknown. The report also did not mention any damage to the pool's blue sealant, nor did it describe any vandals dumping fertilizer. Again, since this article is very long, I'm just going to kind of fast forward to the ending. The coating was made by a California-based company called Rhino Linings. Pierre Gagnon, the president and chief executive of Rhino Linings, said in an email that the peeling appeared to be limited to isolated areas of the pool. Algae has bloomed frequently in the pool for decades now. Its shallow, stagnant water becomes a petri dish for the aquatic organisms in the summer sun. Experts said the algae didn't threaten public health because the water is not intended for swimming or drinking, but they cautioned that if left unchecked, the blooms could give rise to cyanobacteria, which could be highly toxic to ducks, dogs, or other animals that drink the water. Just because it's green algae this week doesn't mean that it isn't going to be cyanobacteria tomorrow, said Ashley Bear, a senior research developer at USALCO, a company that makes coagulants and other water treatment chemicals. Mr. Blair, who spoke to the Times from a gathering of water treatment experts in Washington, adding that the reflecting pool was the talk of the conference. Letter from conservatives prompted inquiry of civil rights group lawyers say. Several right-wing groups sent a letter in September to Stephen Miller, a top aide to President Trump, urging greater scrutiny of the Southern Poverty Law Center. This article is by Alan Feuer. Ever since the Justice Department charged the Southern Poverty Law Center in April with defrauding donors by using its money to secretly pay informants inside extremist organizations. The prominent civil rights groups' lawyers have wondered how the investigation came about. After all, the Law Center's informant programs had faced an earlier round of scrutiny for potential tax violations during President Trump's first stint in the White House, but the inquiry was closed during the Biden administration. In court papers filed on Monday night, the lawyers shed new light on the origins of the renewed investigation using records recently provided to them by the FBI. They said the inquiry appeared to have been prompted, at least in part, by a letter sent in September from several right wing organizations that had been criticized by the Law Center. It was addressed to Stephen Miller, the powerful aide to Mr. Trump, who has often exercised significant influence over decisions at the Justice Department. The letter, jointly written by groups including Moms for Liberty and Turning Point USA, used language about the Law Center that was almost identical at times to language that appeared in an FBI document in October that laid out the basics of the new investigation. To put it succinctly, the lawyer wrote, the Justice Department's justification for opening a full investigation into the SPLC in October 2025 that led to the indictment in April 2026 appears to be a rehashing of a letter sent by conservative groups to Stephen Miller complaining about being designated as hate groups by the SPLC. The lawyers acknowledged that the documents the FBI provided did not explicitly reveal whether Mr. Miller had directed the Justice Department to reopen the investigation, but they added that the facts suggest that may be the case. They also suggested that Mr. Miller had another potential reason to set the Justice Department after the SPLC. In 2019, the group wrote a series of articles drawing on hundreds of Mr. Miller's emails to assert that in the run up to the 2016 presidential election, he promoted white nationalist literature and racist immigration stories. A Justice Department spokeswoman said Mr. Miller had nothing to do with the investigation of the Law Center and that the letter had been provided to investigators by one of the groups that signed it. The White House did not respond to a message seeking comment. The renewed inquiry into the Law Center focused, at least at first, on a publication called the Hate Map. For more than 20 years, the Law Center has used the map to detail the inner workings of well-known extremist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Nations. It has also included more traditional conservative groups like Turning Point USA, which works on college campuses and was run by Charlie Kirk, the pro-Trump activist who was fatally shot in September. According to the FBI document, the Bureau had concluded that the Law Center placed groups on the hate map as a smear tactic solely because they disagree with the ideology of the SPLC. That language closely tracked the language in the letter to Mr. Miller, which said the SPLC places many groups on its hate map as a smear tactic solely because they disagree with its radical left-wing ideology. Both the letter and FBI document also cited identical quotations from critics of the Law Center who called the hate map a partisan progressive hit operation and a willful deception designed to scare older liberals into writing checks. The letter urged Mr. Miller to ask Mr. Trump to issue an executive order removing all information from the Law Center from federal websites and barring the administration from using the group's writings in any government programs going forward. While the president never issued such an order, Kash Patel, the FBI director, announced in October, the same month the investigation was formally reopened, that the Bureau was severing its ties with the Law Center. Mr. Patel said the organization had long ago abandoned civil rights work and turned into a partisan smear machine, singling out their use of the hate map, which he added unfairly targeted mainstream Americans. The Southern Poverty Law Center was formed in 1971 in Alabama and is best known for investigating white supremacy groups like the Klan. But in their letter to Mr. Miller, the right-wing groups, echoing a broader sentiment among Mr. Trump's supporters, accused the center of moving away from its early work and becoming biased, politicized, and unmoored from its original position. Again, due to the length of this article, I'm just going to kind of fast forward to the last couple of paragraphs. The record before the court establishes that this investigation and these criminal charges were incited because the administration disagrees with the SPLC's protected speech on the hate map and elsewhere, they wrote. In their filing to Judge Marks this week, the lawyers said that if she believed the case was filed vindictively, she should force the administration to turn over information about the case. That could include communications, they said, between Mr. Miller and the Justice Department concerning the Southern Poverty Law Center and communications between the department officials in Washington and prosecutors in Alabama about why the case was restarted. Again, if you want to hear the parts of the article that I left out, the number to call is 716-821-5555. Senate votes to check Trump's war powers, rebuking him on Iran. A few Republicans joined Democrats in favor of a measure instructing President Trump to halt military operations against Iran or seek congressional authorization. This article is by Robert Jimison. The Senate on Tuesday adopted a resolution instructing President Trump to end the war in Iran or seek congressional authorization to continue it, delivering the most significant bipartisan rebuke yet of the conflict. The resolution does not have the force of law and is therefore unlikely to compel an immediate change in policy. But the 50 to 48 vote, in which 4 Republicans joined Democrats in favor, marked a striking break by the GOP led Congress with a president who has faced little resistance from his party on any topic, particularly matters of war and national security. It came as Republicans in Congress have expressed skepticism and alarm about the ceasefire agreement Mr. Trump struck with the Iranians after nearly 5 months of war. The measure underscored GOP impatience about continuing to defer to the president, who has never sought approval from Congress for the war, as further negotiations over its end appear precarious, and Mr. Trump has threatened more military action. The vote was also the latest evidence of tension over the war inside the Republican Party, which faces a punishing political environment ahead of the midterm elections in which GOP control of Congress is at stake. With polls showing the conflict deeply unpopular, some lawmakers in the party have voiced concerns about its economic toll, uncertain objectives, and the risk of a broader regional escalation. Tuesday's vote marked the first time since the enactment of the War Powers Resolution of 1973 that both chambers of Congress have approved a concurrent resolution directing a president to end a military conflict. The House passed the measure this month after Republican leaders who had tried to block it were unable to keep the party unified in opposition. In the Senate on Tuesday, Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania was the lone Democrat to vote against the resolution. Senators Rand Paul of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Bill Cassidy of Louisiana broke with fellow Republicans and supported the measure. Their backing in the absence of 2 Republicans who have proposed such measures in the past, including Senator Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky who was recently hospitalized, allowed the resolution to prevail. The law was born out of a clash between Congress and President Richard Nixon over the Vietnam War, with lawmakers overriding his veto in an effort to reclaim authority over decisions of war. The most solemn power for Congress is Congress has the power to declare war, not the president, Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, and a leader of his party's efforts to win passage of a war powers measure, said ahead of the vote. What happens next is unclear. The measure was a concurrent resolution, a vehicle that does not need a presidential signature to take effect, but also does not become law. In 1983, the Supreme Court ruled that to have legal effect outside of Congress, legislative actions generally must pass both chambers and be presented to the president for signature or veto. But supporters of the resolution say war powers measures are different because the Constitution gives the power to declare war to Congress alone. The issue has never been definitively tested before the Supreme Court. Whatever happens with this, it's going to have no effect, said Senator Tim Risch, Republican of Idaho and chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, noting the legal questions surrounding the mechanism. Mr. Trump, he added, was not going to pay any attention to it. But the Republican resistance was notable, particularly as the Trump administration is expected as early as Wednesday to request tens of billions of additional dollars to pay for the war. And Democrats celebrated the vote as an achievement of their goal of registering congressional opposition to Mr. Trump's unilateral decision to start the war in Iran without authorization. They had tried and failed repeatedly in the Senate to do so before Tuesday's successful vote. This war has been bad for the American people, Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat of Wisconsin, said ahead of the vote, casting doubt on the negotiations to wind it down. Congress had the opportunity to end this war months ago, and we should have done just that to avoid this exact scenario. Republicans who opposed the measure argued that it was largely moot, noting that active hostilities had subsided and that the conflict was currently governed by a ceasefire while negotiators work toward a broader, more permanent agreement. Once again, to keep this article to about 5 minutes, I'm going to skip some of the middle and just read the endings. The oscillations highlighted the unease among lawmakers over the president's handling of the conflict, which began with joint U.S. Israeli strikes on February 28th. Mr. Trump signed a memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Iran last week at the Palace of Versailles, and Vice President J.D. Vance has been leading a U.S. delegation in Switzerland for talks on the contentious remaining issues. But Congress has remained sidelined, with top leaders only learning about the memorandum after it was reached and so far receiving scant details on how it would be carried out. Again, as a reminder, you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Protesters accused of Antifa ties sentenced to up to 100 years in ICE attack. The penalties issued in an attack where a police officer was shot dwarf those given to January 6 rioters and appear to signal that at least some courts will deal aggressively with ICE protesters. This article is by Alan Feuer and Krista Torolva. The leader of a group of protesters accused of being members of far-left movement Antifa was sentenced on Tuesday to 100 years in prison after a jury found him and 7 other demonstrators guilty of supporting terrorism while taking part in an armed assault last summer against an immigration facility in Alvarado, Texas. The extraordinary sentence against the protester, Benjamin Song, was only one of the harsh penalties meted out in the case during separate hearings in federal district court in Fort Worth by 2 judges who castigated the defendants for using violence and attacking the democratic process during the protest. 9 young demonstrators, including Mr. Song, were found guilty in March of an array of charges stemming from the attack on the Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility, which resulted in a police officer being shot in the neck. 6 of the defendants who were convicted of terrorism charges, along with Mr. Song, were sentenced to between 50 and 70 years in prison. Another, who was found guilty of lesser crimes and was not even present at the protest, was given a term of 30 years in prison. A final defendant is scheduled to be sentenced next month. The remarkably stiff penalties issued by Judge Mark T. Pittman and Judge Reed O'Connor were significantly longer than the lengthiest sentence handed down to any of the more than 1,500 rioters who were prosecuted and then given clemency for joining the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The most severe sentence faced by a January 6 defendant was a 22-year term given to Enrique Otero, the leader of the far-right Proud Boys. The sentencing in Fort Worth appeared to be a clear signal that, at least in Texas, the courts would deal aggressively with ICE protesters, especially those accused of adhering to the leftist ideology of Antifa, a contraction of the word anti-fascist. Activists who have demonstrated against ICE have faced a concerted crackdown from the Trump administration, including 15 people said to be affiliated with 2 Minnesota Antifa groups who were indicted last week on charges of conspiring to impede federal agents during immigration sweeps in the state over the winter. Both Judge Pittman, who was appointed by President Trump, and Judge O'Connor, who was appointed by President George W. Bush, have reputations as staunchly conservative jurists. Judge Pittman oversaw the trial of Mr. Song and his co-defendants, which was the first time terrorism charges have been brought against purported members of Antifa. Judge O'Connor was brought in after the verdicts were returned to help with sentencings. While the jurors who heard evidence during the trial clearly believed the prosecution's theory that most defendants had supported an act of terrorism when they took part in the attack on the ICE facility, 5 of the government's own cooperating witnesses, people who were part of the supposed Antifa cell, denied under oath that they or their compatriots thought of themselves as belonging to Antifa. The far left movement has no central structure or formal membership. Acting Attorney Todd Blanche celebrated the sentences in a post on social media, saying that the violent extremism has no place in our country. The sentences handed down today make clear that Antifa terrorists who attack law enforcement and federal facilities will face swift and uncompromising justice, Mr. Blanche said. But the relatives of some of the defendants assailed the sentences as overly punitive at a news conference outside the courthouse. In the face of this grotesque distortion of anything that could ever have called itself a process, I am livid, said Lydia Koza, the wife of one of the defendants, Autumn Hill. Hope Song, Mr. Song's mother, said her son would never accept responsibility for what she described as a government lie made to prosecute innocent people in order to get political persecutions. Mr. Trump has long prioritized bringing criminal charges against Antifa activists and other left wing demonstrators who have protested in immigration raids in cities across the country. In September, he issued an executive order declaring Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, a designation that does not actually exist under U.S. law. He also issued a sweeping directive known as National Security Presidential Memo 7, which ordered a whole of government approach to going after anti fascist groups. The memo greatly expanded the definition of domestic terrorism to include a list of political beliefs traditionally protected by the First Amendment, among them anti capitalism, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and even hostility toward those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. The episode in Alvarado unfolded after nightfall on Independence Day last year when a group of about a dozen people arrived dressed in black at the ICE facility known as the Prairieland Detention Center. Some began to vandalize the property, spraying graffiti on a guard shed and a car and damaging a surveillance camera, prosecutors said. Others set off fireworks in what they later described as noise demonstration, hoping that the immigrants detained inside would be encouraged by the spectacle. Mr. Song, a former Marine reservist, stood at a distance with an AR-15 style rifle, and when Lieutenant Thomas Gross of the Alvarado Police Department responded to a call for help at the facility, Mr. Song yelled, get to the rifles," and opened fire, prosecutors said. Lieutenant Gross was struck by a bullet above his collarbone, as the rest of the group fled. He was treated for his wounds and eventually released from the hospital. Alan Greenspan was wrong about one thing. It was a big one. This is an opinion guest essay by Roger Lowenstein. He's the author of America's Bank, The Epic Struggle to Create the Federal Reserve. Whatever else, Alan Greenspan should be remembered for what is surely the rarest virtue among public officials, admitting error. The moment was October 23rd, 2008. The American financial system was in tatters. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers were bust, and the government had taken equity stakes in private banks in a bid to arrest the crisis. Americans were swamped with mortgage debt and suffering through a brutal recession. Mr. Greenspan, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, had retired less than 3 years earlier. No one had championed the free market system or worked to block financial regulation, which he disparaged as both harmful and unnecessary, with more ardor than he had. As head of the most powerful of the agencies that regulated banks, he hadn't used his authority to quash the bubble in mortgage lending. Mr. Greenspan was no corporate toady or business apologist. He was an honest and inquisitive intellectual committed to the principles of Adam Smith, principles that work well most of the time. This was not one of those times, and his conviction was shaken. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself included, are in a state of shocked disbelief. He confessed that day to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Mr. Greenspan questioned the principles he had developed as a young disciple of Ayn Rand and employed in a storied career as an advisor to corporate chieftains and later to U.S. presidents. The modern risk management paradigm held sway for decades, he said, referring to the esoteric economic models that had assured traders of the soundness of the billions in securities that had been layered on top of home mortgages. securities that in 2007 and 2008 suffered tremendous losses and caused banks to fall like dominoes. The whole intellectual edifice, however, collapsed in the summer of last year. Under grilling from Representative Henry Waxman, the committee chairman, Mr. Greenspan bluntly admitted that he had made a mistake. Although he tried to blame it on a flaw in the models, his admission was striking for one who had flown very high, a come down that should be imprinted in the memory of every person in a position of responsibility over economic policy. Alan Greenspan was the country's first and possibly last celebrity Fed chairman. He moved in a world of diplomats and stars. His second wife was the journalist Andrea Mitchell, and for nearly 20 years, his words moved markets. Stockbrokers, as well as ordinary people, parsed them for clues to the future, though it sometimes took a lexicographer to decipher his convoluted phrasing. A friend used to call me when some pronouncement of the chairman's was creating havoc in the stock market. What is he saying? He would excitedly demand. What is he saying? Kevin Warsh, confirmed as the Fed chair last month, seemed to have adopted Mr. Greenspan's penchant for abstruse language. Mr. Greenspan guided the Fed's Board of Governors with a polished and seemingly effortless touch. In Congress, he claimed respect from both parties, quite a feat given his right wing philosophy. Nominated for a fifth term in 2004, he was confirmed by the Senate with just one dissenting vote. More recent Fed chiefs got more than a dozen. In 1999, Phil Graham, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, told Mr. Greenspan, "You will go down as the greatest chairman in the history of the Federal Reserve Bank." Even if Fed chairs tend to be given too much credit or blame for their events on their watch, Mr. Greenspan presided over what was then the longest peacetime economic expansion in U.S. history, lasting from 1991 to 2001. But even during that prosperous decade, the themes of his response to a later mortgage bubble were present. As Mr. Greenspan described in his memoir, his approach solidified in the mid 1990s, a time when the stock market was soaring and new cable news programs and their small investor fans were suddenly taking an interest. In November 1995, the Dow Jones average cracked 5,000, a milestone that represented a doubling in only 5 years. By the following October, the Dow was at 6,000. Shortly after, Mr. Greenspan addressed the annual dinner of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He wondered aloud whether the stocks were showing signs of irrational exuberance. The next morning, panicky traders, fearing that the Fed would intervene, rushed to sell, and the Dow plunged nearly 150 points, although it immediately recovered. As stocks continued their breathtaking rise, Mr. Greenspan confided in his fellow governors that they might have to raise interest rates to squash the speculation. By the following spring, the Dow neared 7,000. The Fed raised rates and the market fell, but once again it came roaring back. By June, the Dow was at 7,800. Humbled, Mr. Greenspan concluded, "You can't tell when a market is overvalued and you can't fight market forces." He never tried to rein in stock prices again. And so a pattern: ignore bubbles as they inflate, intervene if and as necessary to clean up the mess after they pop. In 1998, after the sudden collapse of the giant hedge fund, he led the Fed to cut interest rates 3 times to stabilize markets. Within weeks of those cuts, eBay went public and its shares tripled on the opening day of trading. Greased by cheapmoney.com, stocks inflated in a new bubble. After they collapsed and after a spate of corporate scandals, Mr. Greenspan rushed to the rescue again, cutting the overnight federal funds rate until it reached 1%. Mr. Greenspan's light touch was enough to contain these emergencies, but not the larger one to come. Raised by a single mom during the Great Depression, Mr. Greenspan, who played saxophone for a jazz band before becoming a big time consultant and obtaining a doctorate in economics, was the first Fed chief to think broadly about the revolution in computer technology, and it seduced him. Again and again, he expressed the belief that computers would increase productivity and thus allow the Fed to cut rates further than previously thought possible without stoking inflation. He was prescient in seeing the computer's power, and his resistance to intervening in bubbles would have been correct had he applied it with a little discretion. By the end of his time at the Fed, the huge bubble was inflating Mortgage brokers were peddling loans without requiring borrowers to document their earnings, a sign of troubling excess in the most important asset for ordinary Americans, their homes. The central banker's cliche that one never knows a bubble for sure was true, but the Fed's job was to weigh its relative risks, not certainties. Signs of froth in mortgages were omnipresent. Buyers were getting full financing at teaser interest rates. Speculators chasing quick flips were posing as buyers. 40% of mortgages were going to subprime buyers and those who lacked documentation. Mr. Greenspan made much of the blunt tool argument that raising interest rates risked penalizing the entire economy merely to cool the housing sector. This betrayed the Fed's metamorphosis into an institution of elites, government and academic economists who live in a world of computer models. Before the Greenspan era, the Fed was closer to its original design, an institution of bankers entrusted with safeguarding the banking system. The Fed and its sister regulators had specific tools to stem the crisis. At a minimum, they could have demanded that mortgage banks obtain proof of their clients' income and give loans only to people who could repay them. Mr. Greenspan, the celebrity PhD, focused on the highbrow work of determining interest rates. He failed to crack down on hyper permissive lending terms, grubby, detailed work in which Mr. Greenspan never showed any interest. In recent times, Fed governors with real world lending experience have become so rare that their absence is not even noticed. Mr. Greenspan shaped how modern central banks operate, but even he had to admit that his infatuation with models had been wrong. The country's financial leaders might remember that humbling moment in 2008 and what it showed. Overconfidence and complacency can mar even the most storied of reputations. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mideast Live updates: U.S. and Iran offer conflicting accounts of nuclear discussions. President Trump said Iran had agreed to the highest level inspections hours after an Iranian official said there were no detailed discussions on the nuclear issue, as the two sides continue to present different narratives on their latest talks. This article was updated by Lara Jakes, Leo Sands, and Nick Cummings Bruce. Here's the latest. President Trump and Iranian officials sharply disagreed on Tuesday about whether Tehran had agreed to open its nuclear sites to UN inspectors, one of the several disputes between the two countries that reflected the morass of details still to be resolved. As peace talks were underway in Switzerland, a United Nations Maritime Agency said on Tuesday that it had started an effort to free hundreds of ships and thousands of mariners that have been trapped in the Persian Gulf during the war, moving them through the Strait of Hormuz along a route near Oman's coastline. After Vice President J.D. Vance said on Monday that Iran had agreed to let U.S. inspectors back into its nuclear sites, Iranian officials said on Tuesday that their country did not make any such commitment. In fact, they said the matter was barely discussed. Esmail Baghai, spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry, said there was no plan to invite inspectors to nuclear sites that were hit by U.S. and Israeli airstrikes in June of 2025. They know they're wrong, President Trump said later in the day at an event in Pennsylvania. Earlier, he had posted on social media that Iran had fully and completely agreed to the highest level of nuclear inspections. U.S. and Iranian officials staked out strong positions on other points of disagreement. Secretary of State Marco Rubio kicked off a visit to the Middle East by saying no country, including Iran, was allowed to charge fees or tolls for passing through the Strait of Hormuz, as Iran had indicated it had planned to do. He also said that you can't have an end to hostilities and conflicts in the region unless armed groups supported by Iran also halt their attacks. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian told state media that curbs on his country's missile capabilities would never be a part of a future peace agreement. If we did not have our missiles, which are for our self-defense, Israel and America would have plowed through Iran the way they did Gaza, he said in a news conference in Islamabad, Pakistan. But Iran's nuclear program remains the top issue for the American side. If Iran had not committed to international inspections, Mr. Trump said he would have called off peace negotiations. The chief of the UN's nuclear watchdog agency, Rafael Grossi, said in an interview with Japanese broadcaster NHK World, published on Tuesday, that inspections would commence the sooner the better. But he did not say whether Iran had made a specific commitment or how much access inspectors would have. Iran, which has long insisted its nuclear program is for civilian purposes, blocked inspectors from most of its nuclear sites after last year's attacks by Israel and the United States. Here's what else we're covering. Strait of Hormuz, the International Maritime Organization and the government of Oman said on Tuesday that they had a plan to help hundreds of ships stuck in the Persian Gulf pass through the Strait of Hormuz. On Monday, 39 vessels went through the strait, capping the busiest 3-day period since the Iran war started, but the traffic was still a fraction of what it had been before the war, according to a ship trafficking company, Kepler. Lebanon. An Israeli military attack on southern Lebanon on Tuesday killed 2 people, according to Lebanon State News Agency and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed armed group. Fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon has eased in recent days. Israel and Lebanon were also expected to hold a round of talks in Washington on Tuesday. The conflict is another significant sticking point in the U.S.-Iran negotiations. War powers vote. The United States Senate on Tuesday gave final approval to a resolution instructing President Trump to end the war in Iran or seek congressional authorization to continuing it, delivering the most significant bipartisan rebuke yet of the conflict. Though the resolution does not have the force of law, the 50 to 48 vote for Republicans joined Democrats in favor marked a striking break between the president and the GOP-led Congress. It passed the House in early June. All right, and now in order to end on a little bit of a lighter note, it's been a lot of heavy news today. This article is called Dad Movies for the Ages. What is it about certain kinds of film, a certain kind of film that appeals to fathers? Our writer took a stab at defining dad cinema and rounding up its greatest hits. This article is by Jason Bailey. Dad movie, it's become efficient shorthand, a method for describing or often dismissing a specific kind of film that appeals to men of a certain age and disposition. It's reductive, of course. Not all dads like all dad movies, and plenty of women love them as well. But it's a convenient tag pinpointing a distinctive mix of recurring themes and emotional responses, even if the precise definition of a dad movie is somewhat nebulous. As with other less wholesome forms of entertainment, it often comes down to a matter of I know it when I see it. So, what makes a great dad movie? And if we can settle on the parameters, what are the definitive examples of the genre? The terms have shifted over time. Your classic dad movies were championed by baby boomers, the first generation with easy access to movies on demand via the VHS craze of the 1980s and the concurrent rise of the movies on cable. The Venn diagram of classic dad cinema and TBS Sunday afternoon standbys is essentially 2 overlapping circles. But the children of those dads inevitably became dads themselves, bringing their own preferences and tastes to the mix and widening the windows of dad fare to include 80s and 90s movies they grew up watching, often with their own dads. Certain genres lend themselves to near automatic inclusion. Most Westerns are dad movies by default, between their historical settings, hard nosed action, and frequent musing, implicitly or explicitly, on the complexities of masculinity. War movies are similarly beloved not only for their preoccupations with military tactics and geopolitical shifts, but also for their ground level examinations of male camaraderie, bravery, and loss. Fathers and grandfathers are drawn to sports movies for similar reasons. Beyond their explorations of friendship and teamwork, the subject matter makes them an easy complement to the televised games that they may well share screen time with on a lazy Saturday. I'm going to skip ahead to the list as I'm sure you're as anxious as me to hear what it is. The first one they list is Field of Dreams, perhaps the quintessential dad movie. Phil Alden Robinson's 1989 adaptation of the W.P. Kinsella novel Shoeless Joe combines several key elements of a great dad movie. It is a Valentine to baseball. It features multiple excuses to reach for a hanky. There are 3 moments that reliably make this viewer fall apart. It centers on a complicated relationship between a son and his late father, and it stars Kevin Costner, an easy inductee himself in the Dad Movie Hall of Fame. Hoosiers. This 1986 drama is arguably the best of the sports underdog movies and features a stellar lead performance by Gene Hackman, another shoo-in for the Dad Movie Hall of Fame. His work here as Norman Dale, the head coach of the Hickory Huskers, an Indiana high school basketball team, is magnificently dad-coded, unwaveringly honorable, enigmatic, and taciturn, but in the right circumstances capable of both explosive emotion and unexpected warmth. Shane. If you had to pick one pet Western for inclusion, it would have to be George Stevens' 1953 Odor, notable not only for its magnificent Technicolor photography and Alan Ladd's iconic turn as the title character, but also for his scenes with Brandon DeWild as little Joey Starrett. The unforgettable closing moments of their surrogate father-son relationship will move the most stoic dad to tears. Apollo 13, if we're still carving out spots for that dad movie Mount Rushmore, space must be cleared for Tom Hanks, whose inherent decency, frequent father roles, and twin obsessions with NASA and World War II make him the dad we'd all like to be. Those qualities are abundantly represented in Rod Howard's 1995 docudrama about the miraculous rescue of the astronauts, including Hank's Jim Lovell on the 1970 lunar mission. The quiet beat Ed Harris's mission control commander takes at its conclusion a shattered respite to wipe his eyes, maybe the single most moving moment in all of Dad's cinema. The Great Escape. In addition to war movies, dads love Men on a Mission, movies in which a seemingly desperate group of dudes come together for a common cause, initially clash over tactics and personalities, but ultimately set aside their differences to pull off the operation with professionalism and class. Heist movies like Ocean's 11 also fall under this rubric. One of the first and best was this 1963 classic from the Magnificent Seven director John Sturges, with Steve McQueen and an all-star cast attempting a daring escape from a German POW camp during World War II. Oh, wow. So I'm running out of time. So without the descriptions, the other ones on the list are The Hunt for Red October, Blazing Saddles, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, The Shawshank Redemption, and Terminator 2, Judgment Day. So sorry, I had to race through those to finish on time. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the June 23rd issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Patrice. It has been my pleasure, as always, to read to you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.